The first snow of the year arrived at Lochdubh without ceremony, as most things did. It came softly in the early hours, drifting down from a sky the color of pewter, settling on the thatched roofs and narrow lanes as if the village had been carefully wrapped for safekeeping. By morning, the hills surrounding the small Highland settlement wore a thin white shoal, and the loch itself lay dark and still, reflecting the pale winter light like an old mirror. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys as villagers went about their routines, slowed but not disrupted by the cold. Mrs. McLean opened her shop with gloved hands and a resigned sigh, already anticipating the complaints about frozen milk bottles. At the post office, young lads stamped their feet and laughed, daring one another to touch the iron railings with bare fingers. The hotel stood quietly proud at the center of it all, its windows glowing with warmth and the promise of tea strong enough to wake the dead. Constable Hamish Macbeth emerged from his whitewashed cottage just as the church bell finished striking 8. He paused, as he often did, to take in the scene. The snow had softened the village, rounding off sharp edges and muting sounds, as if Lochdubh itself had decided to speak in whispers. Hamish tugged his police cap lower on his ears and smiled faintly. Snow always made people kinder, at least at first. It reminded them of beginnings. He set off toward the village square at an unhurried pace, his long stride leaving deep impressions in the fresh powder. He noticed everything without seeming to, the way old Mr. Campbell's curtains were still drawn, unusual for that hour. The nervous flutter of the hotel maid's eyes as she hurried past him, the fact that the usual clatter of gossip outside the shop had not yet begun. These were small things. Easily dismissed, Lochdubh was full of small peculiarities. After all, at the shop, Mrs. McLean leaned over the counter and peered at him with sharp, curious eyes. "Cold enough for you, Hamish?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had already decided the answer. "Cold enough to remind you you're alive," Hamish said mildly. "Anything new?" She hesitated, just a fraction too long. Not new, exactly, just quiet. She lowered her voice. "Have you seen Mr. Fraser this morning?" Hamish shook his head. "Can't say I have." "Well, that's just it," she said. "He's never missed opening the boathouse. Not in 20 years. Hamish nodded, but said nothing. He accepted his newspaper, wished her a good morning, and stepped back into the cold. People in Lochdubh noticed absences more keenly than presences. A missing habit rang louder than any bell. As he walked on, the village seemed to hold its breath. Doors closed a little more firmly than usual. Conversations faltered when he passed. Hamish felt it then a subtle schist, like the tightening of a thread pulled too far. Something was amiss, though no one yet had the words for it. Down by the loch, the snow lay untouched, save for a narrow path leading toward the old boathouse. Hamish followed it, hands in his pockets, boots crunching softly. The boathouse itself stood dark against the white, its door ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. He did not hurry. There was no shouting, no sign of struggle, just stillness. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and cold water. Hamish stopped just inside the doorway. He did not need to step any further to know that something had ended here. A cup of tea sat untouched on a crate, its surface filmed with cold. A coat hung neatly on its peg. Everything was orderly, almost respectful, which somehow made it worse. He removed his cap. By the time Hamish returned to the village, the news had begun to spread, not through words, but through looks and silences. Mrs. McLean crossed herself when she saw his face. The hotel maid burst into quiet tears at the bar, comforted by a circle of murmuring women. No one asked questions in Lochdubh. Tragedy moved like the weather inevitable, to be endured together. Hamish made his way back to his cottage as the snow continued to fall, covering footprints, smoothing over signs. He knew the days ahead would be filled with listening more than speaking, with cups of tea taken in warm kitchens and truths revealed sideways through emotion rather than fact. The village would close ranks, as it always did, but it would also talk. It always talked. As night settled over Lochdubh, lights flickered on one by one, glowing softly against the snow. The village looked peaceful, almost untouched, yet beneath that quiet surface, something had shifted. The first snow had come, and with it, a secret that would not stay buried for long. By mid-morning, Lochdubh had found a new rhythm, one shaped by uncertainty rather than habit. The snow kept falling, light but persistent, as if determined to seal the village inside a glass dome. Hamish Macbeth moved through it quietly, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. People nodded to him, offered thin smiles, then retreated indoors, drawn back to fires and whispered conversations. He began where he always did with tea. Mrs. McLean insisted he sit at the small table behind the shop counter, pressing a chipped mug into his hands before he could protest. The kettle rattled nervously on the stove. "It's a terrible thing," she said, not looking at him. "Just terrible." Hamish waited. Silence was often more generous than questions. "He was a good man," she went on. "Kept himself to himself, but always polite. Never caused trouble." She paused. "Which makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Hamish met her eyes gently. "Wonder about what?" she sniffed. "About what people don't see." He thanked her for the tea and left her with her thoughts. Outside, the village square looked unchanged, but the air had thickened with speculation. Grief in Lochdubh rarely shouted. It murmured, crept from hearth to hearth, gathering weight as it went. Hamish crossed the road toward the hotel. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wall. The fire roared, and the smell of bacon lingered stubbornly. A few locals sat scattered about, their conversations halting whenever he came to close. At the bar, Mrs. Wellington wiped an already spotless glass. "You'll be wanting breakfast," she said briskly. "In a bit," Hamish replied. "I was wondering how Mr. Fraser seemed yesterday evening." She shrugged. "Same as always. Quiet. Had his supper. One whiskey. Left early." Her mouth tightened, though he did seem troubled. "Troubled how?" She frowned, searching her memory, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "I asked if everything was all right. He said it was just the cold getting into his bones." She leaned closer. "But I've known that man 20 years. Cold never bothered him much." Hamish nodded. Another small thread added to the weave. He left the hotel and walked down toward the row of cottages near the shore. Curtains twitched. Doors opened and closed. The village was watching itself now, every resident suddenly aware of being part of a story they hadn't chosen. At the edge of the loch, Hamish stopped. The boathouse sat silent, guarded now by a thin strip of tape that fluttered uselessly in the wind. He did not cross it. There would be time later for reports and procedures. For now, he needed to understand the shape of the man who was gone. Mr. Fraser had lived alone in a modest cottage a short walk away. Hamish approached it slowly. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold but tidy. A fire lay laid but unlit. A book rested open on a chair, a finger marking the page as though its reader expected to return at any moment. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Death, he had learned, was most cruel in the ordinary things it interrupted. He noticed a photograph on the mantel. Mr. Fraser as a younger man, arms slung awkwardly around a woman who smiled at the camera with fierce pride. There was no dust on the frame. Someone had cleaned it recently. Back outside, Hamish encountered Mrs. Grant, her shawl pulled tight, eyes red from crying. She did not wait for him to speak. "He helped me after my Angus died," she said suddenly. "Fixed the roof. Brought fish. Never asked for anything." Her voice shook. "People think quiet means secretive. Sometimes it just means kind." Hamish listened, his face solemn. "Did he ever seem afraid of anyone?" She shook her head. "Afraid? No." Then, after a moment, "Worried? Maybe. These last few weeks," he said, "the past has a way of knocking when you least expect it." That phrase stayed with Hamish as he walked on. By afternoon, the snow had thickened, blurring the line between sky and hill. Children were kept indoors. The postman made his rounds in near silence. Lochdubh felt smaller, closer, bound together by shared unease. Hamish returned to his cottage as dusk crept in. He wrote a few careful notes, then stopped. Facts could wait. What mattered now were people, their memories, their feelings, their unguarded moments. Someone in Lochdubh knew more than they realized. Not because they were clever or cruel, but because in a village this small, lives overlapped in ways no one could entirely control. As darkness settled, Hamish gazed out at the softly glowing windows across the village. Somewhere behind one of them, a truth was forming, not in anger or malice, but in something quieter. Regret, perhaps, or love, and those, Hamish knew, were always the hardest motives to untangle. The snow stopped sometime in the night, leaving Lochdubh hushed and gleaming under a pale winter sun. The village looked almost festive, as if preparing for a holiday rather than mourning a death. Hamish Macbeth woke early, as he always did, and lay for a moment listening to the quiet. Even the seabirds seemed to have agreed to give the village space. He made his porridge and ate it, standing by the window, watching Miss Grant shuffle past with a basket on her arm, her shoulders bent against more than the cold. Grief in Lochdubh did not announce itself loudly. It settled into bones and joints, made people older overnight. By the time Hamish stepped outside, the snow had begun to harden underfoot. His breath clouded the air as he walked toward the church. The minister had asked if he might stop by, not officially, just for a word. That was often how things were done in Lochdubh. Nothing written down, nothing declared, but understood all the same. Inside the church, the air smelled of polish and damp wool. The minister sat alone in the front pew, his hands folded, his face drawn. "He came to see me last week," the minister said, without preamble. "Angus Fraser, Hamish sat beside him. "Did he say what was on his mind?" The minister hesitated. "Not directly. He spoke about forgiveness, about whether it was ever too late to ask for it." Hamish said nothing. The minister continued, encouraged by the silence. He mentioned a mistake made long ago, something that had shaped his life. He said he feared someone else still carried the weight of it. The minister's voice softened. He was afraid of causing pain by bringing it up again. Hamish thanked him and left, the words echoing in his thoughts. Forgiveness, regret, the past knocking at the door. They formed a pattern, faint but persistent. Outside villagers greeted him with cautious politeness. There was a sense now that this was not simply a misfortune, not merely a man found dead by the loch. Something unresolved had followed Angus Fraser into the snow. Hamish walked toward the schoolhouse, where Miss Murray was sweeping the steps. She straightened when she saw him, brushing snow from her skirt. "The children keep asking why Mr. Fraser won't be bringing the boat round again in spring," she said. "I didn't know what to tell them." "He was fond of them," Hamish said gently. "Yes, especially the quiet ones." She paused, then added, He used to sit at the back during assemblies, you know. Never stayed long, but he always listened." Hamish thanked her and continued on. Each conversation revealed the same shape. A man reserved but attentive, burdened by something unspoken. At the hotel, Mrs. Wellington handed him a cup of tea without asking. "I've been thinking," she said, "about that night." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "There was someone else in the bar," she said slowly. "Not unusual, except they left just after Mr. Fraser did. I didn't think much of it at the time." "Do you remember who?" She shook her head. "Not clearly." A scarf pulled up high. "They didn't stay long enough to order food." She frowned, but they watched him, not rudely, almost sadly. That sadness again. Hamish stepped outside, letting the cold sharpen his thoughts. Whoever had last watched Angus Fraser had done so with knowledge, not threat. This was not a village of grudges and knives. If harm had come, it had done so quietly, through the slow pressure of old wounds. He returned to the boathouse in the afternoon, standing at a respectful distance. The loch lay calm, its surface dark and unreadable. The snow around the building remained largely untouched. No signs of a struggle, no chaos. Just a man who had come here, as he always did. Hamish closed his eyes briefly, imagining Angus Fraser unlocking the door, hanging his coat, setting down his tea. Something had followed him there. Not a person, perhaps, but a truth long avoided. As evening approached, the village gathered in small groups, sharing meals, exchanging soft words. There was comfort in togetherness, even as suspicion hovered at the edges. No one spoke of murder aloud. The word felt too harsh, too final. Back in his cottage, Hamish wrote again, slower this time. He was not building a case so much as a portrait, and the portrait that emerged was of a man shaped by conscience, not fear. Someone had reached out to Angus Fraser before his death, not to threaten, but to remind of a choice, of a consequence. Hamish leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. In Lochdubh, people rarely intended harm, but good intentions, he knew, could still lead to quiet tragedies. And whatever truth lay beneath the first snow, it would be found not in anger or accusation, but in the fragile space where guilt met levant, waited to be spoken aloud. The days that followed settled into a slow, careful routine, as though Lochdubh were afraid that any sudden movement might crack the thin ice forming over its grief. Snow was cleared from paths and doorsteps, fires were kept fed, and meals were shared more generously than usual. In a village this small, sorrow was never private. It moved from house to house, accepted with tea and quiet company. Hamish Macbeth let the days unfold without forcing them. He understood now that whatever truth waited beneath the surface would not respond well to pressure. People in Lochdubh spoke when they were ready, not when they were asked. On the third morning after Angus Fraser's death, Hamish walked toward the row of cottages near the western hill. A thin trail of smoke rose from most chimneys, but one remained stubbornly cold. He paused outside the cottage, noting the careful way the door had been painted recently, the tidy stack of peat by the wall. Someone took pride here. Someone paid attention. He knocked gently. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Morag Sinclair, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes wary but not unfriendly. She was new to Lochdubh, at least by the village's standards had arrived just under a year ago, with few belongings and fewer explanations. "Constable," she said quietly. "Morning, Morag," Hamish replied. "I was wondering if I might come in for a moment." She hesitated, then stepped aside. The cottage was warm and neat, with the kettle already on the boil. Hamish noticed a folded scarf on the chair by the fire, thick wool, dark blue. "I won't keep you long," Hamish said, settling into a chair. "I've been trying to understand Angus Fraser, not just how he died, but how he lived." Morag's hands tightened around her mug. "He was kind to me," she said after a moment. "Helped fix the fence. Brought firewood when the storms came." "Did you know him before you came to Lochdubh?" Hamish asked gently. She looked down. "No. At least, I didn't think I did." That answer lingered between them. "Angus came to see me a few weeks ago," she continued, her voice steady but thin. "He asked questions about why I'd come here, about my family." Hamish said nothing. "I thought it was curiosity," she said. "That's how it is in villages. Everyone wants to place you somewhere." She swallowed. "But then he asked about a woman named Elspeth." Hamish felt a small shift inside him. "And my mother's name was Elspeth," Morag said. "She left this village when she was young. Never spoke of it. Not kindly." The kettle began to whistle, sharp in the quiet room. Morag stood to turn it off, her back to him. "He said he owed her something," she went on. "An apology, or perhaps the truth. He wasn't sure which would hurt less." Hamish leaned forward slightly. "Did you meet him the night he died?" She nodded, her shoulders stiff. "I followed him from the hotel. I didn't mean to frighten him. I just needed answers." They stood by the loch, she said, the snow beginning to fall. Angus had spoken haltingly, choosing his words as if each one carried weight. He had loved Elspeth once, promised her a life he had not been brave enough to claim. When she left alone and pregnant, he had stayed silent, married later, lived quietly, regretted everything. "I told him my mother died, never knowing why he vanished from her life," Morag said. He cried. I'd never seen a man his age cry like that. Hamish felt the truth settling into place, not sharp, but heavy. "What happened then?" he asked softly. "He grew pale," Morag said, held his chest. "I thought it was the cold. He told me not to blame myself, that he was tired of carrying it." Her voice broke. "I ran for help, but by the time I came back—" She did not finish. She did not need to. Hamish rose slowly. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "That can't have been easy." Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Snow crunched beneath his boots. As he walked back toward the village, his thoughts calm but weighted. This was not a crime born of malice. It was a life bent under the weight of unspoken love and delayed courage. The village would learn, in time, that Angus Fraser had died not because someone wished him harm, but because the past, once faced at last, had proved too much for his heart. As Lochdubh prepared to lay one of its own to rest, Hamish knew the truth would not shatter the village. It would soften it. Some wounds, when finally named, allowed healing to begin even under the quiet fall of snow. The news did not spread all at once. In Lochdubh, truths like this never did. They moved slowly, seeping through the village in half phrases and soft explanations, carried on the steam of kettles, and the careful sympathy of neighbors who knew when not to ask too much. Hamish Macbeth took it upon himself to guide that movement, though he would never have described it that way. He spoke first to the minister, then to Mrs. Wellington, then to Mrs. McLean, always quietly, always with care. He chose his words as Angus Fraser had once done, aware of their weight. By the time the funeral was arranged, the shape of the story had become clearer, gentler. Angus Fraser had suffered a weakness of the heart. The cold and the shock of an emotional meeting had been too much for him. No one spoke of Morag Sinclair as a cause. Instead, she was spoken of as a daughter who had come searching for answers, and had found sorrow rather than blame. The day of the funeral dawned grey. and still. Snow lay thick along the churchyard walls, softened by a recent thaw. The village gathered in their best coats, faces solemn but calm. Grief in Lochdubh was shared openly when it mattered most. Hamish stood at the back of the church as the service began. He watched Morag slip into a pew near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Grant sat beside her without a word, offering quiet solidarity. Across the aisle, Miss Morey dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The hotel was closed for the morning. Even the shop door bore a small black ribbon. The minister spoke of Angus Fraser as a man who had lived modestly and cared deeply, even when he did not know how to show it. He spoke of the courage it took to face one's past, and the cost of waiting too long. Heads nodded gently. Many in the pews recognized pieces of themselves in those words. Afterward, the villagers moved to the hall, where tables were set with sandwiches, scones, and pots of tea. The familiar comfort of routine helped ease the weight in the room. Stories began to surface, small kindnesses Angus had shown unnoticed at the time, but cherished now. "He fixed my gate in the middle of the night," someone said. "He used to leave fish by my door when my husband was ill," another murmured. Morag listened, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. These were not the stories her mother had told, but they were true too. Hamish stood near the window, watching snow melt from the eaves. He felt no triumph, no sense of completion, only a quiet sadness tempered by relief. The truth, once spoken, had not torn the village apart. It had drawn it closer. Later that afternoon, Hamish walked with Morag along the loch. The ice at the edges had begun to break, dark water showing through. She spoke haltingly, as though afraid to claim too much comfort. "I don't know what I'll do now," she said. "I came for answers. I didn't expect this." "You don't have to decide anything yet," Hamish replied. "Lochdubh has a way of making room for people if they let it." She smiled faintly. "My mother used to say, 'The Highlands never forget you.'" I didn't believe her. Hamish did not answer. He rarely contradicted the wisdom of the dead. As evening settled, the village returned to its routines. Altar but intact lights came on. Fires were stoked. Children laughed somewhere, their voices echoing softly against the hills. Hamish returned to the boathouse alone. The tape had been removed. The door stood open, the interior cleaned and aired. The cup of tea was gone. In its place sat a small vase of winter flowers, set there by someone who understood the importance of such gestures. He stood for a long moment, hands in his pockets, listening to the water lap gently against the shore. Angus Fraser's life had ended here, but it had not ended in bitterness that mattered. As he turned to leave, Hamish felt the familiar sense that Lochdubh had settled back into itself. The village had absorbed the shock, learned what it needed to know, and tucked the rest away. Secrets remained. They always did. But for now, there was comfort in the knowledge that even beneath the first snow, truth could emerge not with violence or accusation, but with understanding. And in a place like Lochdubh, that was justice enough. Life did not return to normal in Lochdubh, so much as it found a slightly altered balance, the way a river does after heavy rain. The days grew marginally longer, though the sun still lingered low over the hills, casting long blue shadows across the snow. People spoke of Angus Fraser less often now, not because he had been forgotten, but because he had been absorbed into the village Asilong memory, where the dead were kept gently and without hurry. Hamish Macbeth noticed the change in small ways. The shop door opened with its usual bell again. Laughter crept back into the hotel lounge in the evenings, tentative at first, then more assured. Yet, beneath the familiar rhythms, something new had taken root, a quiet awareness of how much had gone unsaid. For how long? Morag Sinclair remained in her cottage by the hill. Some had expected her to leave once the funeral was over, to return south with her questions answered and her grief neatly packed away. Instead, she stayed. She walked the village paths each morning, nodding politely, gradually becoming part of the scenery rather than an object of curiosity. Hamish watched this with interest. Lochdubh did not accept newcomers quickly, but he remembered blood and history. Morag carried both, whether she wished to or not. One afternoon, Hamish found himself at Mrs. Grant's kitchen table, warming his hands around a mug of tea. Mrs. Grant talked as she always did, in a meandering way that eventually arrived at its destination. "My Angus," she said, meaning her late husband. He once carried something for years he should have spoken of. By the time he did, it was too late to change much. She glanced at Hamish. But it changed how I saw him, how I remembered him. Hamish nodded. Memory, he knew, was a living thing. Later that day, he encountered Miss Murray outside the schoolhouse, her arms full of books. "The children have been asking about Morag," she said. "They want to know if she's staying." "And what did you tell them?" Hamish asked. "That it's up to her," Miss Murray replied. "And up to us, in a way." That, Hamish thought, was as true as anything he had heard all week. The village meeting that followed was informal, as such gatherings always were. A handful of residents lingered in the hall after a charity event, conversations drifting naturally toward Morag and the cottage that had once been Angus Fraser's concern. No one spoke of blame. Instead, they spoke of repairs needed, of winter stores, of whether Morag might need help with firewood. It was Mrs. McLean who said it plainly at last. "She's Elspeth's girl," she said, "and Elspeth was one of ours, whether she left or not." There were nods at that. The decision, such as it was, settled without argument. Hamish walked home under a sky beginning to clear, stars pricking through the dusk. He felt the quiet satisfaction of something resolved, not through authority or instruction, but through collective understanding. Lochdubh policed itself in its own way. A few days later, Hamish saw Morag standing by the loch, staring out at the dark water. He joined her without comment. "I've been thinking about my mother," she said, about what she might have felt, leaving here the way she did. "Places linger in people," Hamish replied, "especially places like this." She smiled sadly. "I used to think she was running away. Now I think she was carrying something she didn't know how to set down." They stood in silence, the wind whispering over the water. As Hamish turned back toward the village, he reflected on how close the truth had come to remaining buried. Another few weeks, another year, and Angus Fraser might have died with his regrets intact, his story unfinished. Instead, a conversation painful but honest had changed how he would be remembered. There was no villain in that, no triumph, only the quiet recognition that leaves intersected in ways unseen, and that even gentle places could hold heavy histories. That evening, Hamish sat by his fire, writing nothing at all. The case, if it could be called that, was finished. There would be paperwork eventually, explanations for the authorities beyond look. But here, among these hills and these people, the truth had already been accepted. Outside, the last of the snow began to melt, trickling into the earth. Spring would come, as it always did, uncovering what winter had hidden. Lochdubh would endure, changed in ways that only those who lived there would ever fully understand. And Hamish Macbeth, content in the knowledge that listening had once again proved more powerful than force, stared into the flames and let the village breathe around him. The thaw arrived gradually, as if the land itself were reluctant to let go of winter all at once. Patches of dark earth appeared along the path, and the snow retreated to the shadows beneath stone walls and hedges. With it came a loosening in the villager's sense that what had been held tight inside chests could now be released, slowly and without shame. Hamish Macbeth felt it most clearly in the way people spoke to him. Where once there had been caution, now there was reflection. Villagers lingered a little longer in conversation, their words less guarded, their eyes more thoughtful. One morning, as Hamish collected his newspaper, Mrs. McLean leaned across the counter and said, "It makes you think, doesn't it, about all the things we assume we know?" Hamish smiled. "It does. I used to think Angus Fraser was simply a man who kept to himself," she went on. "Turns out he was carrying a whole life the rest of us never saw." Hamish did not disagree. In Lochdubh, assumptions were comfortable things, worn like old coats. It took something unsettling to make people notice how threadbare they had become. Later that day, he walked a long way around the village, past the cottages near the shore, and up toward the grazing land beyond. The hills looked softer now, streaked with green where the snow had withdrawn. From this height, Lochdubh seemed small and close-knit, a scatter of roofs bound together by history and habit. He thought of how easily the village could have chosen a simpler explanation for Angus Fraser's death. Suspicion would have been easier, in some ways. It would have given people somewhere to direct their unease. Instead, they had accepted a truth that offered no villain, only regret and consequence. Not everyone found that easy. At the edge of the common, Hamish encountered Mr. Calder, his face set in a familiar scowl. "You're telling me no one's to blame?" Calder said, not bothering with a greeting. "Man drops dead after a confrontation, and that's the end of it." Hamish regarded him calmly. "I'm saying what happened was not born of malice." Calder snorted. "Doesn't make it right?" "No," Hamish agreed, "but right and wrong aren't always tidy." Calder muttered something under his breath and walked on. Hamish watched him go, understanding the discomfort behind the anger. People liked their stories clear. This one refused to be. That evening, Hamish found Morag at the hotel, sitting near the fire with a book she was not reading. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. "Some people still look at me as though I should apologize," she said quietly, "for asking questions." "You didn't cause his death," Hamish replied. "You gave him the chance to speak." She nodded, though doubt lingered. "I keep wondering if I should have waited, if I'd come sooner, or not at all." Hamish sat opposite her. "We always imagined better timing after the fact. Life doesn't often grant it." The fire crackled between them, a small, steady sound. Around them, the hotel hummed with low conversation, the ordinary noise of life resuming. Over the following days, the village continued its gentle reckoning. People spoke more openly about those who had left Lochdubh, about letters never sent, words never said. The story of Angus Fraser had opened a door, and through it came old memories, not all of them comfortable. Miss Murray introduced a lesson at school. About listening, really? Listening to one another. Mrs. Grant began sorting through her late husband's belongings, something she had avoided for years. Even Mr. Calder, after a fashion, softened, bringing a basket of peat to Morag's door one morning without comment. Hamish observed these changes with quiet approval. This, he believed, was the real work of understanding, not the solving of a single mystery, but the way it reshaped a community. One afternoon, as he stood by the lock, Watching the water darken with approaching rain, Hamish reflected on how easily the past could lie dormant, waiting. It did not need anger to endure. It survived on silence just as well. Angus Fraser had lived with his silence for decades. In the end, it was not punishment that came of it, but release too late to save his life, perhaps, but not too late to change its meaning. As the first drops of rain fell, Hamish turned back toward the village. Lochdubh stood steady against the shifting weather, its people bound by shared understanding and shared restraint. The case, if it could still be called that, had never been about death alone. It had been about the cost of unspoken truths, and the quiet courage required to face them. And as the village moved forward, carrying both its comforts and its burdens, Hamish knew that beneath the familiar routines, something subtle had changed. Lochdubh would remember this winter not for the snow, but for what finally came to light beneath it. Spring did not arrive in Lochdubh all at once. It announced itself in fragments, a crocus pushing through thawed soil, the return of birdsong at dawn, the loch losing its iron-dark stillness and taking on a softer, shifting blue. The village breathed differently now, as if the long winter had left behind not exhaustion, but clarity. Hamish Macbeth noticed how people lingered outdoors longer than necessary. Gates became places for conversation, walks stretched on. There was a quiet appetite for presence, for not retreating too quickly into private rooms and private thoughts. Morag Sinclair had become part of that rhythm. She no longer moved through the village with the tentative politeness of a visitor. She stopped to speak with Mrs. McLean about bread recipes, helped Miss Murray plant seedlings behind the schoolhouse, and spent afternoons repairing the fence. Angus Fraser had once promised to mend properly come spring. One evening, Hamish found her there, sleeves rolled up, hands dirt-streaked, studying the line of posts with concentration. "He never did get around to fixing it," she said with a small smile. "No," Hamish replied, "but he liked knowing it needed doing." She laughed softly at that, then grew thoughtful. "I've been wondering whether to stay, not out of obligation, just because it feels right." Hamish leaned against the fence. "Sometimes places choose people as much as the other way around." She nodded, as though she had suspected that all along. The official paperwork arrived from Inverness a few days later. It was brief, clinical, and entirely unsatisfying in the way official documents always were. Natural causes, contributing factors, no further action required. Hamish read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. That version of events would exist somewhere beyond Lochdubh, stripped of nuance and weather and human weight. Here, another understanding had taken hold, one shaped by shared memory rather than ink. The village did not mark the passing of the case with ceremony. Instead, it absorbed it into daily life. Angus Fraser's name was spoken now without hesitation. His story, incomplete as it was, had been woven into the larger fabric of Lochdubh's history. On a mild afternoon, Hamish walked a long path along the loch, past the boathouse, now returned to its ordinary purpose. A new lock gleamed on the door. Inside, fishing gear was neatly arranged, and a notice had been pinned to the wall, offering shared use to anyone who needed it. Hamish paused there, listening to the water lap against the shore. The loch had witnessed everything: the arrival and departure of lives, the quiet accumulation of years. It asked nothing in return. Later, at the hotel, conversation turned to plans for the summer fete. Someone suggested a boat race. Someone else proposed a memory table where villagers could place photographs of those no longer with them. "It might be nice," Mrs. Grunt said, "to remember them properly while we still can." There were murmurs of agreement. Hamish sat back, watching the exchange with a sense of quiet completion. The village was not erasing the past. It was integrating it, allowing it to inform rather than haunt. As dusk fell, he walked home through streets warmed by late sunlight. The cottages looked much as they always had, but the village felt subtly older, less guarded, perhaps, more willing to acknowledge that beneath familiar routines lay complicated lives. At his gate, Hamish paused, taking in the view of Lochdubh spread before him. Somewhere inside those houses were stories still untold, regrets not yet named, kindnesses unnoticed. That was the nature of small places. Intimacy did not guarantee understanding. It only made the opportunity unavoidable. Inside his cottage, Hamish poured himself a dram and sat by the window. The loch reflected the fading sky, calm and inscrutable. He thought of Angus Fraser, of Elspeth, of Mirog, standing at the fence with soil on her hands, and possibility ahead of her. Justice, he reflected, did not always arrive in the form of answers. Sometimes it arrived as permission to stay, to speak, to remember differently. Outside, the village settled into evening. Fires lit, doors closed gently against the cooling air. Lochdubh carried on, as it always would, its secrets not erased but held with care. And as the light faded, Hamish Macbeth felt certain of one thing. Whatever else lay hidden beneath the surface of this place, it would not remain buried forever. Not here, not where people still knew how to listen. The year turned quietly, without ceremony, as years often did in Lochdubh. Summer edged closer, bringing longer evenings and a softness to the air that invited doors to be left ajar and conversations to wander. The hills grew greener, the loch lighter, as though the land itself had decided it was safe to exhale. Hamish Macbeth settled into the season with the same unhurried acceptance he brought to everything else. Mornings began early, with birdsong and mist lifting from the water. Afternoons were shaped by small interruptions, someone needing advice, someone else wanting nothing more than to be heard. Evenings drifted past in the quiet companionship of the village, where solitude was never quite lonely. The memory of Angus Fraser no longer pressed heavily on the village, yet it had not faded. His presence lingered in subtler ways, in the repaired fence that now stood straight and sturdy, in the shared use of the boathouse, in the way people paused before dismissing a silence as emptiness. Lochdubh had learned once again that still waters often held the deepest stories. Mirog Sinclair remained. It was not announced. One day, it was simply understood. Her cottage showed signs of permanent new curtains, a garden patch turned over for planting. She walked the paths with an ease that came not from confidence, but from belonging earned gradually through attention and care. Hamish watched her one evening as she stood talking with Mrs. Grant. Their heads bent together, laughter soft and there was no sense now of a debt owed or a burden carried. Only connection, imperfect but real. "You've done a good thing, staying," Mrs. Grant said, as Hamish passed them later. "She's done it herself," Hamish replied. That, he knew, was the truth. Lochdubh did not save people. It offered them space to decide who they wished to be. On a warm night, near the solstice, the village gathered by the loch for a modest celebration, nothing formal, just food shared and stories told, as the light lingered far past its usual hour. Children chased one another along the shore. Older villagers sat wrapped in blankets, watching the water and the sky as though they had all the time in the world. Someone produced a fiddle. Someone else sang a little off-key. Laughter rose and fell, unremarkable and therefore precious. Hamish stood apart for a moment, observing. This, he thought, was the real measure of a place, not the absence of sorrow, but the way it continued in its presence. He felt no sense of finality, no neat closing of a chapter. Life in Lochdubh did not work that way. Stories overlapped, paused, resumed years later in altered forms. What had happened beneath the first snow was not an ending, but a revelation, one thread drawn gently into the light before being woven back into the whole. As the gathering thinned and people drifted home, Hamish walked along the loch's edge. The water lay smooth and dark, reflecting the last pale streaks of daylight. He stopped where the boathouse stood, its door closed now, unremarkable again. There was comfort in that ordinary. He thought of all the moments that never became events. The words Angus Fraser might have spoken years earlier. The Elspeth might have lived, had courage arrived sooner. The quiet resilience of a daughter who came seeking truth and found a place instead. None of it could be changed, but it could be held differently. Hamish turned back toward the village, its lights scattered like stars across the hillside. Somewhere behind those windows were conversations yet to happen, reckonings yet to come. Lochdubh did not promise peace forever. It promised only continuity, the chance to live alongside one's past rather than be ruled by it. At his gate, Hamish paused, listening to the familiar night sounds. Water moving, leaves stirring, the distant bark of a dog. The village slept lightly, as it always had, aware in some deep, collective way that life was never entirely settled. He went inside and closed the door gently behind him. Outside, Lochdubh remained as it always would, welcoming, watchful, and quietly full of stories. Some would surface, others would wait, patient beneath the calm surface until the moment came for them to be known.